Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. We've got an exciting hour ahead of us. My name is Erin Hancock. I serve on the NASCO Education Board. I also work with the Canadian Cooperative Association out of Ottawa, Ontario. I'm very happy to be able to introduce our keynote today. We've got Andrew Cornell here with us. Many of you have heard of him. Some of you have major crushes already, and we understand why. He certainly wears a lot of hats. He's been involved as an organizer in many different movements, certainly anti-war, anti-prison work, labor organizing. Currently, he's a visiting assistant professor of American Studies at Williams College in Massachusetts. And within that role, he focuses his work on progressive and radical social movements in the U.S. from the mid-20th century to the present day. He's also an author and a writer, and you can, hopefully he'll share with us some of his books, but you may have heard of Oppose and Propose, Lessons from Movement for a New Society. It was published in 2011. And that is for an organization that was a feminist pacifist organization that was active in the 70s and the 80s. And they were looking at collective living, consensus decision-making, and horizontal forms of organization. And you can read more about Andrew on page 7. But I think it's important that we have him here today because in this year, 2012, the International Year of Cooperatives, it's so important for us to think more globally about what it is that we do. And when I say globally, I don't just mean geographically globally, but also in what movements does our movement intersect? Where do we naturally have allies in social justice, in the solidarity economy, in the third sector? And how is it that we work with those groups in an effective way? And Andrew might raise that there are lots of ways that we don't engage as much as we can, and that we don't align as much as we can with other organizations that do share similar values. He'll give us some opportunities for us to walk away from here and build stronger connections with some of the movements that seem like natural fits for what we do as well. So in reading through his bio, I think we might all say that perhaps he's superhuman. So I did find out that he is also human, and that is his favorite food is burritos. So just bring it down to earth a little bit more for us here today. But I'm very proud to welcome Andrew to the stage to share some of his wisdom with us. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm definitely human. Well, it's a true honor to be asked to give a keynote address at the NASCO conference this year. Before I say anything more, I just really want to give a thank you to Esteban Kelly and Emma Rubin, to Erin, who invited me and made it possible for me to come, to the entire staff and board of NASCO for organizing the conference. And I also want to say thank you to my friend Melissa Palma, who is allowing me to stay here at Intentional Community while I'm here, and I think is an outstanding example of the kind of politics that I want to talk about today. Well, it's an honor to talk at NASCO because, first of all, co-ops have had a major positive influence in my life. I've lived in cooperative houses here in Ann Arbor. I want to give a shout out to the Haywa House in Philadelphia and in Brooklyn, and I've been a working member of food co-ops in each of those places as well. In 2001, 4 friends and I bought a rundown 5-bedroom house in West Philadelphia, which we call the Lap. Short for the lap of luxury, but also just has this kind of comfy feel to it, the lap. So as we and an assortment of new housemates fixed it up over the years, it became a mainstay of a community of radical queer, anti-poverty, and anti-war activists in the neighborhood, long after I moved on to other things. But when the last members of the original group were ready to move on from the house after 10 years, NASCO provided invaluable assistance in transferring ownership of the house to the Life Center Association, a kind of consortium of cooperatively owned houses and apartments in Philadelphia. So I have a personal appreciation of the knowledge and skills that NASCO disseminates. I'm particularly excited to year, given the theme of the conference, cooperating to survive and thrive beyond capitalism, building a solidarity economy. In his magisterial history of cooperative and communalist movements in the US for the people, John Curl notes that the new co-ops that sprung up in the 1960s, like many of their predecessors, struggled between their dual identities as pure and simple cooperatives and a radical social movement. And since that time, I think many student housing cooperatives have tended towards the pure and simple model of co-ops, meant to serve as affordable housing and spaces for creative folks to socialize, providing personal benefits to specific subcultural groups, experimenting, interested in exploring non-traditional music, non-normative sexualities, and really working through recipes involving large quantities of nutritional yeast. Way too much nutritional yeast. And this undoubtedly has a value in itself, offering some degree of personal liberation. But is that enough, is the question. I think it's becoming more and more obvious that for us and for everyone else on the planet to survive and thrive, we need to create massive, innovative, and radical social movements that can move us beyond the logic of capitalism, as well as the logic of racism, sexism, and heterosexism. Capitalism ensures that the world will permanently remain at war. Capitalism also spells climate catastrophe, with Hurricane Sandy as the latest evidence of how quickly weather patterns are changing all over the world. And this all on top of the everyday violence that capitalism imposes on poor and working people in the form of poverty, insults to personal dignity on the job, and the limits it places on people's ability to reach their full potential. So it's very exciting that NASCO is devoting itself to this project so explicitly by asking in what way housing and worker cooperatives can effectively contribute to social transformation. I think the Occupy movement has brought this question back to the fore, especially as regards housing co-ops and intentional communities. The experience of living communally in protest encampments has rejuvenated the sense among many activists that building model communities of like-minded people should be a movement priority. And I take as example one in that this flyer circulating around Manhattan this spring. And I certainly realize the complexity and diversity within the Occupy movement. So it's not to say that any old flyer is representative of how everyone feels. But nonetheless, I want to share a few ideas here. It says, "We occupied Zuccotti Park as a provocation, but that became beside the point. Living together and building a community quickly captured our attention. We created a self-organized space where we took care of each other." And further down, "Ultimately, our greatest threat was the fact that we established a self-contained, functional community that did not rely on government, that operated on communitarian principles rather than greed, and that openly spoke about inequity." So I think this is a fairly common idea and concept. It shows up in books such as John Holloway's Crack Capitalism or Richard Day's Gramsci's Dead. And I think it's also potentially a very attractive notion to some cooperatives. But I also want to suggest that this idea of building communities that in some ways are an example that can prefigure the society that we want to see has some potential risks that may undercut or derail social movements as well. As Slavoj Žižek said when he addressed Occupy Wall Street, "There's a danger. Don't fall in love with yourselves. We have a nice time here, but remember, carnivals come cheap." So as my title suggests, I think to arrive at a better world, we need to invent or build up new institutions, including worker co-ops and housing co-ops. But we also need to reclaim or win back resources and forms of power from those that have usurped them from us. And we do that through strategic organizing campaigns that target elite power holders and force them to make concessions to us. Co-ops, as one form of counter-institution, can make crucial contributions to movements, but let's just also be aware of some of the obstacles they might pose. Figuring out how to build up and win back our world under current circumstances is not at all easy, and I don't claim to have anything near a complete vision to offer. That's why I have the word might, the ways co-ops might contribute to a better world in my title. However, I think we do have resources available, and one of those resources is that of history. It's useful to recall that cooperatives and communalism have been central to movements of social transformation for more than 200 years. So today I want to recount a bit of that history to try to recover a few of the lessons earlier generations of us have learned regarding this question of what role co-ops might play in social change. I'll pay particular attention to the experiences of Movement for a New Society, which Aaron mentioned briefly, a group that I wrote this short book about, Oppose and Propose. And I'll conclude by suggesting a basic model of movement building that I hope will orient us in some of our future struggles, or at least spark some conversation and we can debate it out. Okay, so to start, I think that one thing that's both promising and challenging to remember is that co-ops have sought to serve as an alternative to capitalist economics. But historically, radicals have also sought in them alternatives to sexist and heterosexist family structures. And at times, as I'll discuss, co-ops have even played a role in struggles against racism. So, they stand at the intersection of a number of different movements. I want to briefly talk about a few of those. The earliest versions of socialism saw building cooperative workplaces and communities as the primary strategy for challenging the new types of misery spawned by capitalism in the Industrial Revolution. Most famous among these is New Harmony, formed in Indiana in 1825 around the vision of Robert Owen, a British industrialist and reformer who coined the term socialism. Over 900 people settled on the farmland that Owen bought and established. Together they made productive farm facilities to produce and sell silk, wool, bricks, oil, and other products. And 9 or 10 similar cooperative joint communities that also included workplaces sprang up in the wake of New Harmony on the American frontier. Members at New Harmony used hours of labor as a currency with which to purchase goods in the colony's store. And while New Harmony thrived for a couple of years, it broke up only about 3 years later in disputes over personal conflicts and the attempt to move to a communal system where each could take according to need, regardless of the amount of work that they contributed. Most of these other 9 or 10 cooperative communities broke up quickly as well, often due to financial hardship. John Pearl notes that for most of the intentional communities, banks still owned the land that they were farming. So the communalists suffered from large mortgage payments for years. So it was hard to really build up some capital to expand their operations and be stable, and even to build contiguous colonies, as they were called. In the 1840s, more than 30 cooperative colonies were again formed in the United States, based on the ideas of Charles Fourier, most famously Brook Farm in Massachusetts, an inspiration to the Transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson. And these lasted a little longer than the first round, but all of them broke up within about 10 years. Albert Brisbane, perhaps the most prominent proponent of cooperative colonies in the 1840s, kind of gave voice to the optimistic thinking behind such efforts, the strategy, really, for obtaining socialism. He says, the whole question of effecting a social reform may be reduced to the establishment of one association, which will serve as a model for and induce the rapid establishment of others. And so this was the basic impulse behind what became known as utopian socialism. Build alternatives, and they'll create change by sheer example. is kind of changed by osmosis as people see, well, this is obviously a much preferable way to live than working as a wage slave, and I'm going to go out and replicate this. The reality was that the colonies never stood as quite a shining example as they intended. And they weren't able to attract people in exponentially growing numbers. As I said, they had a hard time working it out economically, as they were still working within the confines of the economic system. And people realized that there were real trade-offs to moving to these colonies. You may lose a degree of privacy, etc., for some of the benefits that you gain in having a more stable working environment. So this idea that if we just create examples, others will follow, and all of a sudden we can federate all of our intentional communities, proved to be disappointing to those that advocated it to begin with. But there was another group of people in the 1840s that were also building alternative cooperative communities, and I think they're less studied and less known. Black and white abolitionists also established cooperative communities in the 1840s. Places like Neshoba, Tennessee, and Northampton, Massachusetts. They did so for 3 reasons. 1, to provide a basis for impoverished former slaves to provide for themselves. Secondly, to demonstrate the possibility and the desirability of new social relations, in this case, interracial cooperation and living together. And then third, to raise funds for anti-slavery campaigning, newspapers, speeches, etc., and for direct action campaigns, raids on plantations to directly free slaves and help them move through the Underground Railroad to escape to freedom. In fact, the Dawn Colony in Ontario, Canada, became the end of the line for many traveling on the Underground Railroad. And that lasted for over 10 years, fading out with the Civil War. So, I see these abolitionist communal colonies as something of an important departure from the utopian socialists. The colonies weren't seen as sufficient in themselves, but one aspect of a larger movement. They could serve as a gathering center of like-minded people, a source of income for people on the edges of the mainstream economy, and they could serve to provide resources or subsidize organizing campaigns and forms of direct action against oppression. So as the U.S. entered the so-called Gilded Age, the 1870s, 1880s, characterized by the rise of corporations, massive factories, and extreme divisions of wealth, labor movements picked up this strategy also. Typically, they built a triad of institutions: labor unions, political parties, and worker-owned cooperative businesses. Some sought to improve conditions within capitalism, others to do away with the system of bosses and wages completely, to practice self-management of their workplaces. And here I think we need to mention briefly the Industrial Workers of the World, founded in 1905, which famously called on workers to build a new world in the shell of the old. And they saw from their experience that they had to proactively organize with other workers to resist their bosses. They fought for short-term reforms that would attract growing numbers of members until they had enough power to stage a general strike and take over industries and other institutions themselves. But this idea of building the new world in the shell of the old spoke to another component of their program, which is this idea that they needed to create their own unions and other institutions in an egalitarian way, to create this idea of counter-institutions, so that eventually, if they were able to pull off this general strike, they already were practiced in the forms of organizing that they saw as replacing the old forms. So they needed to think through how they were actually going to do this, how they were going to run the economy. Anarchists were active in the IWW, and anarchists carried on the tradition of communal living. It seems to me that they formed some of the first cooperative houses in urban areas. Prior to that, a lot of these colonies had been out in rural areas on the frontier. But anarchists kind of did one thing: they separated this idea of having a communal work environment from having a living environment, and thought, well, we might not be able to do both at the same time. We may still be wage slaves, in our work lives, but at least we can live together, share a sense of community, reduce costs, etc. And so I wanted to share a little passage of a little-known book. A man actually in Philadelphia named Bob Helms translated the memoirs of a Jewish anarchist in Philadelphia from the turn of the century that was originally written in Yiddish. So I wanted to share a story of an early cooperative house, a couple of early cooperative houses, and the challenges that they faced. And see if it sounds at all familiar to any of you. It took place in 1906. It was already a good few years after the demise of our first dream, the cooperative shoe and hat store. Many of us began to feel a yearning to do something. We began to talk amongst ourselves about forming a committee. Several comrades came to me and suggested that the committee start by setting up a cooperative house. And so they went around and they found a house. Altogether, they had 12 members living there. And this house succeeded for a number of years pretty well. They were paying $35 a month rent. Each member brought in $10, and they were saving some money to buy a communal farm. They say that at one point, the famous Russian revolutionary Yekaterina Breshkaya arrived in America. She came to Philadelphia for 2 weeks. The Philadelphia parlor radicals rejoiced and were sure that she was sure to stay with them. We started to campaign that she should lodge with us in the cooperative house, because how could it possibly be otherwise? And we did indeed win. She chose to be with us, the proletariats. You can imagine our jubilation. However, this first cooperative house was not to be, there started to be internal conflicts. Some people stopped paying their rent or their contribution to the house fund. There were romantic entanglements and a variety of other conflicts which caused the house to break up. Several years passed. Once again, a desire was felt to pursue cooperative activity. We, the Philadelphians, went to look for a new house. This time, we rented a 6-room house on Morse Street for $15 a month. The members were Comrade Levin and his wife, Comrade Kaplan and his wife, Comrade Zaramber and I, 6 in all. Everything was going along nicely. It was clean and tidy. I began to weave my dreams for the future. I thought, now that we are so few in number, our success is assured. But my joy was in vain, premature. Again, it was proven how each and every experiment is doomed when those with whom one shares a dining table do not share in the work to advance the intended goals for which the experiment is carried out. Furthermore, in many cases, certain individuals join for entirely different motives. It didn't take long before it became clear that Comrade Kaplan had come to Philadelphia with the aim of bringing his lover from New York into the cooperative house. A written war was going on between the lover and Kaplan's wife. When Kaplan's wife found out that the lover wanted to come, she immediately agreed to it. She openly declared, and Comrade Kaplan knew about this, that she planned to throw carbolic acid in the lover's face. It didn't matter to her, she said, if she would get the electric chair. She began to receive letters from the girl, saying that she was very ill. Comrade Kaplan's wife insisted that he bring her to the cooperative house. She apologized and conceded that all the letters she had sent were foolish. Comrade Kaplan wanted to know my advice about the new turn with his love affairs. I told him that I was terribly afraid that this was nothing more than a scheme of his wife's to bring his lover in order to better carry out her plan. Alright, so suddenly a telegram arrived one Saturday saying that the lover was coming that very day. Comrade Kaplan and Fanny, his wife, went to the train station to meet her. They kissed, that is, the two rivals, Vera Bayer and Fanny Kaplan. On Sunday, our entire commune went to the park. We had a wonderful time. At that moment, it really appeared as if everything would be all right. On Monday morning, we all went to work, leaving Fanny and Vera in the house. Truth be told, everything was going too well and cordially. I felt that sooner or later something would have to happen, and it came a lot sooner than I thought. First, Fanny made an attempt at poisoning Vera by putting poison in a glass of seltzer. When that didn't succeed, she poured a cup of hot fat she had ready on Vera while passing a glass of coffee. Vera was immediately taken to Hahnemann Hospital. Wanting to avoid the involvement of the law and fearful of public opinion, we presented it as an accident. She scalded herself through carelessness. Right? So it was actually really bad burns. She survived. But when she got out of the hospital, Fanny Kaplan left for Boston with her children the day after her deed. After leaving the hospital, Vera Bayer went back to New York and took rooms with Comrade Kaplan. I had thought that Kaplan was one of our comrades whom fate had caused such a sad love tragedy. The subsequent facts showed that he hadn't earned the title of comrade. He abandoned the children and Fanny with no support whatsoever. He had a child with Vera Bayer, and later had the gall to claim that the child was not his, let alone take any responsibility for supporting it. And soon he found another lover. So thus was born the Manarchist. All right, so a few things to take from this little story. Obviously, when people are experimenting with free love, non-monogamy, polyamory, sometimes it can cover over other intentions and really terrible sexist behavior. But secondly, of course, this idea that our interpersonal relationships can wreak havoc in our communities and can take over our attention and distract us from doing our other work. So there are real challenges, of course, as I think probably most people who have lived in communes, collectives, etc. know. So basically, I guess this is an early indication of the motto I learned when first moving to Philadelphia: house booty is bad booty, guest booty is best booty. So, when you study history, you don't have to repeat our mistakes. All right, so I want to skip ahead because I don't have a ton of time. I think there was a kind of a dip in cooperative living in the early part of the 20th century. But we can really think back to some of the amazing communal households that developed and communities that developed in the 60s and the 70s. Has anyone here seen the documentary The Cockettes? No? I have to encourage you to watch The Cockettes. It is a documentary about a group of radical, gay, cross-dressing, acid-head communists living in a collective house or two in San Francisco in the late 60s and early 70s that put together this amazing performance troupe. And I think just like initiated so many amazing forms of gender fuck and radical gay liberation politics. Am I scandalizing? And one thing amazing about the Cockettes commune was that they had an entire house behind a locked door that was full of 1940s thrift store clothes that they could sort through and wear at will, right, and use as props for their performance in everyday life and at the theater. So there's things like that. There was things like separatist, lesbian, feminist communes. And so in that sense, there was a lot of work being done around gender in these open spaces created by co-ops. I want to spend the rest of my time, though, talking about another social movement from that same era, the late 60s, the early 70s, and into the 80s, that saw cooperatives as being at the heart of the practice. And that's this group called Movement for a New Society. MNS for short.
Yeah. So M&S existed from 1971 to 1988, 17 years or so. At its height, it had about 300 members, but I think that number is pretty low compared to the impact that it had through the types of trainings it did, the model it created, and its influence on the anti-nuke, environmental, women's rights movement, and the worker-owned and member-owned food co-op movement in the United States. M&S was created by a group of radical Quakers who were inspired by the radical pacifist tradition of the 1940s and were active in the anti-Vietnam War movement, especially based in Philadelphia. They were called a Quaker Action Group. And they did things like Witness for Peace, like sending ships full of medicine to both North and South Vietnam during the war. But by 69, 70 or so, they started to think it's not enough to end this crazy war in Vietnam. We need to fully transform almost every aspect of life in the United States if we're going to prevent further wars, if we're going to create a really livable future. Okay? And so what they did was they were hopeful. At first they went to the American Friends Service Committee with a proposal to transform it into a radical social movement. And they had a proposal that read like this. We hope to catalyze a movement for a new society, which will feature a vision of the new society and how to get there. A critical analysis of the American political economic system, a focus on expanding the consciousness and organizing the commitment of the middle class toward fundamental change through nonviolent struggle, often in concert with other change movements, the organization and development of nonviolent revolutionary groups and life centers as bases for sustained struggle on the local as well as national and international levels, training for nonviolent struggle, and a program rooted in changed lives and changed values. So there was this sense that there was an external struggle and an internal struggle, work to be done both amongst the members of the group and in the broader society. And M&S went around recruiting, especially at first from other Quaker communities. And this was helpful in that they had resources and people they could talk to, but they kind of felt that it later came back to bite them in the ass because it was a fairly limited group of people that they originally set out to bring in, and so their group tended to reflect the fairly white and middle class base of the Quaker community at that time. Still, reporting back on one of these recruiting trips, a couple members reported that the wholeness of the M&S approach, from analysis to action to community, generated excitement. More and more people are questioning the value of their scattered activities. Fewer and fewer are willing to put off their personal growth until after the revolution. So they had this idea of this kind of multi-pronged strategy. You analyze the world around you, you create action, that is, you organize to get change in specific aspects of life, anti-war, environmental, etc., often using direct action. And in the process, you build community. You build a living community, and you build a set of other counter-institutions that will benefit the movement. All right? And I think M&S was one of the places that really started to disseminate this idea of prefigurative politics, of the idea that your movement should look like the society you want to see, that you should become the change that you want to see, etc. M&S saw that in starting fresh, it had the chance to incorporate in its structure the principle, which was expressed most recently by the New Left, but earlier by anarchists and radical pacifists, that the movement should prefigure or anticipate and model its goals in its work. In the introductory pamphlet that M&S produced, they said, traditional forms of organization, from AT&T to the Parent-Teacher Association, we declare our opposition to them, for they exhibit the sexism and authoritarianism we seek to supplant. Our goals must be incorporated into the way we organize. Thus, the movement we build must be egalitarian and non-centralized. And one of the ways that they tried to carry this out the most was their kind of updating of Gandhi's idea of be the change that you want to see. And they called that live the revolution now. They said, we want to live the revolution now amongst ourselves, in our cooperative houses, in the ways that we interact with one another. That is, we want to kind of challenge old ways of interacting. We want to develop our full capacities as human beings. But what's very important, I think, is that they saw this as part of a multi-pronged strategy, as I said. They said, we need to simplify and organize our life together so that there's time for the confrontations that are needed if the old order is to fall. Okay? So what kind of action work did they do? They were instrumental in building the anti-nuke direct action movement. They helped to create a blockade of arms shipments that were going to East Pakistan in the early 70s, seeing that as an expression of U.S. imperialism. They helped to take back the night marches, early ones that were fairly, confrontational. So there was a lot of work that was around this idea of organizing, building coalitions with other groups, trying to pull people into the movements, and using direct action then as a tactic within these larger strategies of organizing to create fundamental change. The other thing they did was to build up their communities. And one thing that's kind of amazing is I found, while doing some research, a census of the M&S households in West Philadelphia in 1976. And it's a long ways to go around, but I'll pass it around. Pretty amazing. There were at that time 22 collective houses with over 150 members living in them. Church Mouse, Red Tree Cedar House, Cool Rock Amazons, Daybreak, Farragut House, Pink the Cass, Rainbow Race, Stone Menagerie, on and on and on. And then members living in these houses broke up and worked in a number of collectives around the neighborhood. So I'll just hand this in if you want to take a peek at it. So while creating their collective houses, they also created other forms of counter-institutions. They created worker-owned and run publishing house, New Society Publishers, still publishing today. They created, members in Baltimore created a toy store, kind of wooden toy store. They created the Mariposa Food Cooperative, still operational today. They created a feminist summer camp for girls called Mountain Meadow Country Experience that now is a sliding scale summer camp for kids with queer parents, still exists today. So a whole bunch of these different counter institutions. At the same time, they offered trainings. They had what they called the Life Center, this collection of 17 or 18 houses in West Philadelphia. And they would have people come from all over the world, from Australia, from Sweden, from India, etc., and kind of train in direct action, consensus decision making, and how to have meetings, things like that. So the organization really took off. It had chapters in 20 different cities, in Tucson, here in Ann Arbor, in Madison, in Savannah, Georgia, in San Francisco, in Seattle. So really kind of across the United States. And as I said, influenced, I think, a lot of the direct action, nonviolent organizing that was going on at that time. Right, but what I wanted to do, since we're talking about lessons, is to talk about some of the problems that started to emerge within Furniture Society and why it's not with us today, even though it had a fairly long run. And there's a few things. One of those is that some of the members coming into it had different ideas about what was this role of living collectively than the initial founders did. One of the founders was named George Lakey. He remembers, shout out to George, he's an amazing man. He remembers encountering newcomers to the Philadelphia Life Center in the mid-70s who saw it as another intentional community, and quote, this is an interview I did with him, they wanted lifestyle to be the leading edge of change. And he had to explain to them that the cutting edge of M&S's understanding of revolution is not lifestyle change. We think of it like ashrams in Gandhi's ideas, which were base camps for revolution. So what do you do in the base camp for revolution? you get ready to go on the barricades. So this was an idea where cooperatives could help their members do some important growth, learn to be better organizers, learn to facilitate meetings, work through some of their internalized forms of sexism, homophobia, racism, etc. And it was meant as a resource to the movement in that they could lower their living costs. There was no one was paid in movement for a new society for their work, so they would work half-time, live cheaply in the collective houses, and then spend about half their time out in organizing campaigns. Likewise, some of the counter-institutions could raise money, they could earn a living for some of the members who were working on the book publishing collective, etc. There was another idea that he saw, another purpose that he saw those institutions serving. One was basically this idea of how do you show your neighbors that you're not a bunch of total wingnuts, with utopian ideas that really don't connect to their lives, right? How do you do that? So you're not isolated and alienated, like, okay, that's the collective over there, but they don't take you seriously when you're trying to talk to them about anti-war organizing, anti-police brutality organizing, etc. So he said, these institutions like the food co-op can show that these radical ideas can actually make real improvements in people's lives on a day-to-day basis, right? And the idea wasn't that's not going to radicalize other people like that. It's not enough, like the utopian socialist thought. But it's at least an opening to give a little bit of legitimacy and an opening to have conversations. And I think I was reflecting and talking to some of the folks who are coming from New York City right now. And after Hurricane Sandy, a lot of the Occupy organizations have reconstituted themselves and are providing all kinds of emergency services, bailing people out, providing like bicycle-powered electricity so people can regenerate their batteries on their cell phones, finding food, things like that. So that's pretty amazing, right? Where the federal government has refused to do so, right? For probably the same reasons that they refused to provide a lot of services in New Orleans. There's all kinds of redevelopment opportunities and things like that, according to some of the comments there, Joshua Stevens. So that kind of gives me a sense of, this is great. This is another kind of more recent example of what some of the counter-institutions that movements build can do. And that's not going to change people's minds overnight, but it's a concrete contribution that radicals can make in people's lives that can start some conversations. Okay, but so not everyone thought that way. Some people thought that just living in the life center itself, or living in these houses, was radical enough. Another member, Betsy Rosh-Gilman, said that in the late 70s she saw M&S splitting into two different groups. The hard-bitten shop floor organizers on the one hand, and the New Age hippie flakes on the other hand. And she was kind of exaggerating and being silly. She said, my husband was one of the New Age hippie flakes, and I was on the side of the hard-bitten shop floor organizers. But it did give a sense of priorities, that in some places this idea that lifestyle change was kind of taking over the prior focus on organizing campaigns. And that kind of the members came into conflict over that. I found a letter at the Wisconsin Historical Society from an M&S member named Janet Hilliger, caustically voicing her concerns regarding the subcultural tendencies growing with M&S. She wrote, "What responsibility do we have to the many people who are culturally unlike us? Is our aim a new uniform society? Everyone living in communes, working in food co-ops for lower prices, smoking marijuana, practicing nudity and free love, eating vegetarian, and changing their last names?" There's a lot of last name changing. So I think that it took time for M&S members to see that rather than creating a model of the new society, they were establishing one of many possible new lifestyles that grew out of a specific configuration of values that they themselves prioritized. One former member insightfully reflects, a lot of what was defining our culture was our rebellion against white culture. So we were a counterculture, but we were actually counter to white culture. And so this made M&S's internal culture less appealing and transformative to some people of color and some white working class people who had a different relationship to this dominant white middle class culture to begin with. It wasn't impossible to reach, but it was something that they needed to actively think about, and think about if in having a prefigurative lifestyle, living the way they wanted to in the future, naked and vegetarian, with different class names, they were actually turning away some people that may have been receptive to their ideas and values on a larger scale. So they were attracting some people who weren't that into the struggle based on some of this lifestyle stuff and pushing other people away. And one problem that they really had was to break out of being a almost solely white organization. They never really solved that problem entirely, but I kind of pushed some of the members on it when I was interviewing them and asked, so how did you at least try to overcome that problem? And they gave one example that I thought was really interesting. At that time in West Philadelphia, there was an urban homesteading movement that was mostly made up of working class people of color. And it was this idea of, squatting basically, going in and taking over abandoned houses, living in them, putting people who were homeless into these houses. A lot of like what's going on now. And M&S was able to mobilize some resources there so that they had this kind of quick phone tree, where if they needed some support for an action to defend a house, they could pull people out. And they were able to do that, and then they were also able to offer some construction skills to help people fix these houses up again. So they had their own houses, they didn't need to squat more houses, but they became allies to another group that had, and they provided resources, and that was a moment of kind of building some coalitions with other people in their neighborhood. So they said that was a good start. They found that they were kind of proud of that, but it didn't go far enough. All right, so we're starting to run out of time, and I want to kind of try to pull out and get to a little bit more abstract concept from some of these lessons from M&S and some of these earlier movements. And I have a little handout that I was going to pepper the crowd with. I only made 100 of them, and Aaron's coming around with some of them from behind. So, one thing I wanted to suggest is that we kind of push our concepts forward a little bit. There's this idea of prefigurative politics, that our ends should be in line, our means should be in line with our ends, that we should live the revolution now, etc. But I want to suggest that maybe we think of a few different kinds of prefigurative politics and can assess these different kinds individually. The first is this idea of prefigurative lifestyle, which I just mentioned has some drawbacks to it. The second is the idea of prefigurative counter-institutions themselves. Co-op houses, worker-owned, productive co-ops, radio stations, emergency relief organizations, free schools, all kinds of variety of our own organizations that incorporate our anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian values and try to provide real services in the world. And then the third kind of prefigurative politics is prefigurative organizing campaigns. That is, we think long and hard about the ways that we structure our social movements so that we don't replicate the forms of inequality that we're trying to fight against. And I think here, in the 20th century in the United States, the standout organization that many are modeling themselves after was SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, from the early part of, in its early phase, from 60 to 64. And the wisdom of organizers like Ella Baker and Bob Moses. And if you're interested in the ways that they organized and the ways that they challenged kind of charismatic leadership and sought to develop the leadership capacities of all their members, I'd encourage you to read the book by Charles Payne called I've Got the Light of Freedom, with a biography of Ella Baker by Arbor Ramsey. Okay, so in your hands, some of you have this insane chart. with a bunch of arrows and a bunch of words, and it's kind of confusing. And I'll let you take a look at that in your free time. But here's the basic idea that I come away from this kind of historical study with. I think we need to think about social movements that can pair organizing campaigns, these prefigurative styles of organizing campaigns, with prefigurative counter-institutions. We need to think about how the counter-institutions on the one hand can play an important role, and that they can benefit and help build up the organizing campaigns rather than work at cross purposes with them. Right? And in doing that, I think we can build capacity, build membership, accumulate resources, and build power. So how so? Let me just say a few words on that before I wrap up. All right. I think that if our counter institutions are always in dialogue with our organizing movements, then they can think about what actual needs individual people have on the ground, the people that are most affected by the different forms of oppression that we're seeking to oppose. So that means that they're serving these organizing campaigns. When they're detached from organizing campaigns, they can often function as clubhouses. They can be a cool place to hang out for people who are already in the know, but they can be alienating when they're full of jargon and full of kind of extreme cultural practices that other people don't know about. On the other hand, if you have organizing campaigns with no counter-institutions, we don't have a big vision, we don't have a transformative vision, and people can't see that there are other ways of living than we currently are. So often you kind of end up fighting for reforms without an idea of revolution that we're moving towards. So both of these things, I think, can help us move towards a moment, and it may be a fantasy moment. It's probably not in our lifetimes. But it's a moment where there's some sense of a mass withdrawal of participation, or what some people call a general strike, or other people call an insurrection, or what happened in Tahrir Square in Egypt, where there's a kind of sense of a fundamental rejection of no. And it's at that point that you're going to need your counter-institutions to be up and running and functional if we want to really implement something alternative. Because as we saw with the Tahrir Square, people made a huge change and got rid of their longtime dictator, but then it was replaced by a junta of military leaders, and there's a kind of continual process in that struggle. So I think if we go for that effort of insurrection, and there's a tendency amongst some folks today, it's like it's coming. It's apocalyptic thinking on the left. Everything's going to transform in this one moment if we just confront the state hard enough. If you do that, having not organized enough and not built coherent enough counter-institutions, you're doomed to be repressed, to have other aspects of the movement repressed, and really it should just discourage yourself. So I think if we can think about these components together, organizing counter-institutions, eventually building towards a kind of massive withdrawal of participation, that at least gives us something of a kind of meta theory to move towards. And with that, I guess I'd say I would be happy to hear your thoughts on this and see if it's totally crazy or if it's helpful. But I appreciate, again, very much the honor of being able to address all of you today. And I hope you take something away.